Robert Anderson laid the thick folder on the polished mahogany. The click echoed, a sharp report in the heavy silence, cutting through the thin smile Frank tried to maintain. Patricia offered a glass of water, her eyes flat. "We need to discuss Sarah's future," Robert said, his gaze hard on Frank. "Separate from yours." Frank felt the floor drop out. The text message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a blunt instrument in the quiet hum of Frank Miller's office. It was from Chad Anderson. "Family meeting at the estate this Sunday at 4 p.m. Important. Don't tell Sarah. It's a surprise." Frank's thumb hovered over the screen. His gut clenched, a familiar knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He knew Chad. He knew the Anderson family. Robert and Patricia, Sarah's parents, tolerated him, sure. They had to. He was Sarah's husband, after all. But acceptance? That had never been on the table. He was the architect who had built his own firm from nothing, the working-class kid who had dared to marry into their old money. He walked over to Jim's desk, the phone still clutched in his hand. Jim, his partner and longest friend, looked up from a blueprint, pushing his glasses higher on his nose. "Look at this," Frank said, holding out the phone. Jim read the text, his brow furrowing. He looked at Frank, then back at the message. "Don't tell Sarah, a surprise." He shook his head slowly. "Smells like a trap, Frank, pure Anderson. But why keep Sarah in the dark? Because it's about you. It's always about you, with them." Frank nodded. Jim saw it, clear as day. The Andersons, with their sprawling estate, their generational wealth, their carefully curated social circles, had always treated Frank like an interesting but ultimately undesirable specimen. His ambition, his drive, his very success were foreign to them, almost vulgar. They preferred their men pre-approved, inherited. He walked back to his desk, the fluorescent lights humming above him. He picked up his phone again, his jaw tightening. He typed a terse reply to Chad. "I'll be there." The words felt heavy, a quiet resolve settling deep in his bones. He knew what he was walking into. He just didn't know the exact nature of the ambush. Sunday arrived, bringing with it a thin, pale winter light. Sarah was on the sofa in their living room, a worn leather-bound photo album open on her lap. She was tracing a finger over a picture of them on their wedding day, her smile soft, nostalgic. "Can you believe it's been 4 years?" she asked, not looking up, her voice a little dreamy. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime." Frank stood in the doorway watching her. He felt a pang of guilt, the lie he was about to tell, tasting like copper in his mouth. "I wish I could stay," he said, forcing a lighter tone than he felt. "But I have that client meeting about the new development out in Cedar Rapids." Sarah looked up, her smile fading slightly. "On a Sunday? They always make you work too hard, Frank." "Just one of those things," he mumbled, already turning towards the door. He grabbed his keys, the weight of the upcoming confrontation already pressing down on him. He had chosen a dark suit, feeling the need for armor. The drive to the Anderson estate was short but felt endless. The bare branches of the oak trees scraped against the gray sky. The house rose, grand and imposing, at the end of a long, winding driveway. Frank had parked his sensible sedan among their expensive German cars countless times, always feeling like an interloper. Today was no different. The massive oak door, carved with an intricate family crest, loomed before him. He rang the bell. Patricia Anderson answered, her smile thin and practiced, a mask Frank knew well. Her eyes, however, were flat, betraying nothing. Chad was in the living room, standing by the fireplace, a smirk playing on his lips. Becky, Chad's wife, sat stiffly on a gilded armchair, her hands clasped. And Robert Anderson, Sarah's father, stood by the heavy mahogany table in the center of the room, a thick manila folder clutched in his hand. The atmosphere was oppressive, heavy with unspoken intent. It was an ambush, plain and simple. Frank stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click. He refused to sit. He stood his ground just inside the entrance to the living room, his back straight. Robert finally spoke, his voice calm, even. "Take a seat, Frank." Frank met his gaze. "I'll stand." A flicker of annoyance, swift and almost imperceptible, crossed Robert's face. Patricia stepped forward, her voice saccharine sweet. We appreciate you coming on such short notice, Frank, especially on a Sunday. Frank's eyes were still on Robert. Did I have a choice? Robert pushed the thick manila folder across the polished surface of the coffee table. It slid smoothly, stopping just short of Frank's standing position. The muted sound of the papers shifting inside was the only noise for a moment. Robert's eyes were steady, devoid of emotion. We need you to sign these papers, Frank. Frank looked down at the folder. The top sheet, visible beneath a clear plastic cover, bore the stark black letters, Divorce Agreement. He let out a short, humorless laugh, a sound that felt brittle in the expansive room. Are you serious? He asked, his voice low, incredulous. Patricia sighed, a slow, deliberate exhalation that implied great patience on her part. It's for Sarah's own good, Frank. You never truly understood what it means to be part of this family. You never contributed. You certainly never respected our traditions. Her words were soft, yet each one landed with the weight of an accusation Frank had heard countless times before, delivered in various forms. He hadn't understood their country club memberships, their summer homes, their old money sensibilities. He had just built things. Chad, still by the fireplace, scoffed. Your whole presence here, Frank. It's always been a performance. Frank turned his head slowly, fixing Chad with a stare. The smirk on Chad's face seemed to waver slightly. A performance? Frank echoed, his voice flat. You mean like ambushing me with a room full of people and shoving divorce papers in my face without Sarah knowing? The question hung in the air. Robert's jaw tightened. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. Frank's gaze swept across their faces, then settled back on Robert. The immediate anger had passed, replaced by a cold, insistent demand. Where's Sarah? Robert shifted, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, but Frank caught it. Robert looked at the antique clock on the mantelpiece, then at Chad, avoiding Frank's eyes. That's not important right now. Frank's voice sharpened, cutting through the carefully constructed calm. Where is my wife? The emphasis on my wife was clear, a direct challenge to their assumption of control. Robert finally met his gaze, a flicker of something Frank couldn't quite decipher, annoyance mixed with resignation. Sarah isn't here, Frank. We decided it was best to handle this without involving her initially, to spare her the distress. The words were delivered with a paternalistic air, as if protecting Sarah from him, from the truth. Frank felt a cold surge of something akin to betrayal, not just for himself, but for Sarah. They had gone behind her back, planned her future without her input. He glanced at Becky, Chad's wife, who sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on a point just past Frank's shoulder. There was a subtle tension in her jaw, a faint tremor in her clasped fingers, a small crack in their united front. Becky usually maintained a practiced neutrality, but today her discomfort was clear. Robert leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the folder. We prefer to do this the easy way, Frank. It will be less complicated for everyone involved. His voice held an unspoken threat, thinly veiled. Frank didn't flinch. And the hard way? He asked, his voice still low, almost conversational. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air between them, a palpable weight. The Andersons, in their expensive clothes, in their opulent living room, thought they had him cornered. They believed their wealth and influence were enough to force his hand, to make him disappear quietly. They expected him to fold, to show the working-class deference they believed was his natural state. But Frank wasn't done. A slow smirk, thin and dangerous, spread across his face. He reached inside his jacket pocket, pulling out a slim, dark blue folder. It was plain, unassuming, a stark contrast to Robert's corporate-looking beige one. Actually, he said, his voice carrying just enough to cut through the oppressive silence, I have a surprise for you, too. He tossed his folder onto the coffee table, a casual flick of his wrist. It landed with a soft thud, a less imposing sound than Robert's had made, but its impact was far greater. He watched their faces shift one by one. Patricia's practiced smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. Robert's fingers, which had been resting confidently on his own folder, stilled. Chad's smugness vanished, replaced by a flicker of bewilderment. Robert, perhaps still operating on autopilot, reached for Frank's folder. He opened it, his gaze falling on the first few pages. The color drained from his face, slowly, steadily, leaving his skin a pallid gray. Patricia, seeing her husband's sudden pallor, snatched the folder from his trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the document, her own hands beginning to shake as she flipped through the pages. Chad, bristling with sudden anxiety, leaned over her shoulder, snatching one of the loose sheets. He read it, his eyes widening. "What the hell is this?" he choked, the carefully constructed composure of the Anderson family dissolving around him. Frank, still smirking, leaned back slightly, his arms crossed. "Proof," he delivered, the single word cutting through their dawning panic. A crushing silence filled the room, heavier than before, thick with an entirely new kind of dread. The papers in my blue folder detailed months of meticulous work. Not just my work, but the subtle digging Jim and I had done. The documents weren't about sentiment, they were about numbers, shell corporations, and land records. They laid out in stark black and white the financial improprieties tied to Robert Anderson's various real estate dealings. Specifically, there was a secret land deal for the proposed new industrial park on the edge of town, a deal that would displace several small, generational farms and pollute the local watershed. Robert had been quietly acquiring the land through intermediaries, using his influence at City Hall to rezone, and all while preparing to sell it to a major corporation for a massive profit. He was doing it all under the radar, far from public scrutiny, and certainly without any input from the community. It would profoundly change. Robert, still pale, finally looked up from the page he was holding, his hand trembling slightly. His voice, when it came, was a harsh whisper. "This is extortion, Frank. You're trying to extort us." I met his gaze evenly. My voice was calm, almost dull. "Just leveling the playing field, Robert." But Patricia's practiced smile had completely vanished. Her lips were drawn back in something akin to a snarl. "You think you can threaten us? And Anderson? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Her anger felt raw, stripped bare of its usual refined veneer. I let her words hang. "Actually, I think I have a pretty good idea. You see, my firm," I began, my gaze sweeping over them, "we specialize in architectural integrity. And sometimes, to ensure that, we have to look into the integrity of the entities we work with. Or in this case, the entities around us. We've been looking into irregularities in Anderson properties for months now, initially out of professional curiosity. The numbers just didn't quite add up on a few public projects." Chad, who had been simmering in the background, puffed out his chest. "That's a lie, you wouldn't dare." I cut him off, my voice sharp, leaving no room for his bluster. "Wouldn't I, Chad? Or is it that you don't want me to dare? Like the details of the kickback scheme you ran on those city contracts for the downtown revitalization project, the ones where you steered bids to your cousin's shell company, inflating costs by 15% and split the difference? I have the bank statements, Chad, the dates, the amounts, the offshore accounts." Chad's face went from indignant red to ashen gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the weight of his guilt. Becky, who had been sitting stiffly, her face a mask of silent discomfort, stood up abruptly. She muttered something about needing air, her voice barely audible. She didn't look at anyone, just made a quick retreat towards the door, her movement stiff. There was a faint hint of guilt in her eyes as she avoided my gaze, a crack in their seemingly impenetrable facade. "You see," I continued, turning back to Robert and Patricia, who now looked more shocked than angry. "My original intent wasn't blackmail. It was just to understand the landscape, to make sure we weren't inadvertently building on shaky ground. But then you pulled this." I gestured to Robert's open folder, the divorce agreement still visible. "You went behind Sarah's back. You tried to orchestrate a divorce, my divorce, without her knowledge, all because you judged me unworthy. You dismissed our marriage and dismissed her feelings, dismissed me. That's when I decided that the playing field needed to be leveled, and this information could do just that." I paused, letting the implications sink in. "These findings, if they go public, won't just be an inconvenience. They'll be a tsunami. Public outcry, investigations, legal battles, class action lawsuits from those farmers losing their land, political scandals. Your reputation, Robert, your family's carefully constructed monument to wealth and respectability, it will crumble. You won't just lose money, you'll lose everything you value more than money. Your name, your standing, your legacy. Robert surprisingly regained a sliver of his usual composure. He took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing, the shrewd businessman re-emerging from the panic. "All right, Frank," he said, his voice now lower, calmer. "We can talk about this. We can make a deal. What's your price? A substantial settlement, quiet, discreet. You sign the divorce papers, you keep silent. We can offer you enough to start a new life far from here." I shook my head slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching my lips. "This isn't about money anymore, Robert. Not for me. This is about truth." I looked directly at him, then at Patricia. "And I want to speak to Sarah, now, alone. I'm going to tell her everything." The Andersons hesitated, looking at each other, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning defeat. They knew in that moment that the narrative had irrevocably slipped from their grasp. I left the Anderson estate that Sunday with the silence of their stunned faces still in the air. Robert, his voice tight, had agreed to arrange a meeting with Sarah. "You'll hear from us," he'd said, a veiled promise or a threat. I couldn't be sure which. The heavy oak door had closed behind me, shutting away their disarray. The drive home was a blur. The cold afternoon light filtered through the bare trees, doing little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within me. I called Jim as soon as I got to my car, before even pulling out of the driveway. He picked up on the second ring. "So how'd it go?" Jim asked, his voice laced with an eager tension. "They tried to serve me divorce papers," I said, my voice flat, "without Sarah knowing, and I gave them my own folder." There was a pause on the other end. Then Jim let out a low whistle. "Damn, Frank, you didn't waste any time. What did you give them?" "Proof of Robert's land deals, Chad's kickbacks, everything." Jim was silent for another moment. "You just poked a bear, Frank. A very rich, very dangerous bear." "You sure about this?" "I didn't see another way, Jim. They were going to strip everything from me, including Sarah, without so much as a conversation." "Yeah," Jim said, "I get it. Just be careful. They won't take this lying down." The conversation with Jim ended, leaving me with a mix of grim satisfaction and an unsettling sense of what was to come. Later that evening, a text came in from Sarah. "Meeting canceled? You seemed off earlier. Everything okay?" It was simple, innocent, and it hit me harder than any of the Andersons' accusations. The weight of her family's deception and my own complicity in not telling her sooner pressed down on me. I stared at the message, the words blurring on the screen. How was I going to tell her? There was no easy way. The next day, I met Sarah at our downtown loft. I had suggested we meet there, away from the familiar comfort of our home, hoping the neutral ground might make things easier. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on the sofa, her hands clasped. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and the usual light in them seemed dim. She looked up as I entered, a mixture of hurt and confusion on her face. "So what happened with this client meeting?" she asked, her voice quiet. "And why did Mom just text me, asking if I'd talk to you?" She sounded really weird. I took a breath, the air in my lungs feeling heavy. I sat across from her, leaning forward. "Sarah," I started, "there was no client meeting. I went to your parents' estate yesterday." Her brow furrowed. "My parents? Why, what's going on, Frank?" I recounted the ambush, the whole sordid scene, carefully, factually. The cold living room, the four of them waiting, the folder Robert slid across the table. "They had divorce papers ready for me to sign," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the anger I still felt. "Your family orchestrated a divorce, behind your back, without your knowledge, because they didn't think I was good enough for you." Sarah's face went pale, her mouth opened slightly, then closed. "Divorce? No, Frank, that's not possible. My parents wouldn't—" Her voice trailed off, disbelief warring with the cold, hard facts I was laying out. Then a flush of color rose in her cheeks, and her eyes narrowed. "They did what? How dare they? How dare they go behind my back like that?" The anger in her voice was directed clearly at her family. I let her anger settle for a moment, letting the initial shock and betrayal sink in. Then I knew I had to go further. That's not all, Sarah. I reached for my own dark blue folder, which I had brought with me. While they were busy deciding our future, I was busy discovering theirs. I slowly began to reveal the contents page by page, careful to present the facts without embellishment. I started with the financial wrongdoings, the inflated contracts, the kickbacks, the land deals that would uproot families and damage the environment. I talked about Robert's shell corporations, Chad's backroom dealings. I watched her face as the cold reality set in. Her initial anger began to give way to a deeper, more profound devastation. "My God," she whispered, her hands shaking as she picked up a document outlining the environmental impact of the proposed industrial park. "All those years, I always thought something wasn't quite right, the way Dad talked about necessary sacrifices for progress. But I never imagined this." She struggled to reconcile the image of her perfect family, the pillars of the community, with the undeniable evidence laid out before her. The weight of her family's corruption, something she had always vaguely sensed but never dared to confront, seemed to crash down on her all at once. "And you," she finally said, looking up at me, her eyes filled with a new kind of pain. "You gathered all this? Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why let me live in this lie?" Her voice was quiet, but it cut through me. I met her gaze, the truth difficult to articulate. "It started innocently, Sarah. Just professional curiosity, looking into some irregularities with Anderson Properties. Then, when they tried to push me out, to erase me, it became a necessity. For self-preservation, yes, but also for justice. I hoped your family would eventually accept me without me having to resort to something so drastic. I was afraid of hurting you, of showing you this side of them. I wanted to protect you from it." She looked at the papers, then back at me, her expression unreadable. The conversation ended on a fragile note, the air between us thick with unspoken questions. Trust, not just in her family but in our own relationship, felt deeply shaken, a delicate glass object teetering on the edge of a table. Sarah, still reeling from the financial revelations I had laid out, didn't hesitate. I learned later, piecing together her fragmented accounts and the panicked calls I started receiving, that she had gone straight to her parents. She confronted Robert and Patricia in their living room, the same room where they had tried to ambush me. They, of course, had tried to minimize, to deflect, to discredit me. They had called me a vengeful opportunist, an outsider who misunderstood their complex business dealings. They said I was manipulating her, twisting facts for my own gain. But the raw evidence I had presented earlier, the spreadsheets and the land documents, had already sown a seed of doubt she couldn't ignore. What they didn't know was that I had made sure to leave something else for her. A small, dark flash drive tucked almost invisibly into the very bottom of the financial folder. I knew Sarah. Her desperate curiosity, once piqued, would lead her to examine every piece of information I had given her. And that flash drive contained more than just financial details. It held the personal. I pictured her, alone in our loft, the weight of the family's deception heavy in the air. I imagined her plugging the drive into her laptop, the screen lighting up, the communication logs, the discreetly taken photos, the culmination of weeks I'd spent piecing together a much darker narrative. The drive revealed Patricia Anderson's long-standing affair. Not just an affair, but one with a prominent city councilman, a man who had for years consistently ensured the smooth and quiet approval of some of Robert's most questionable land deals, the very ones that were now threatening to unravel the family. The disgust Sarah must have felt would be profound. Her mother, the paragon of Midwestern propriety, the woman who had lectured me on tradition and moral standing, was a hypocrite. She was using her own illicit affair to grease the wheels of her husband's illicit business, a betrayal on multiple fronts. Sarah later recounted the confrontation to me, her voice tight with a mixture of disbelief and rage. She had marched back to the estate, the flash drive's contents displayed on her phone, and confronted Patricia directly. She had seen her mother's cold composure shatter, replaced by raw panic, a desperate plea for silence that was choked and shameful. Robert, already cornered on my financial threats, had been blindsided. The revelation of his wife's infidelity, exposed in such a brutal, public manner within their own home, tied directly to his illegal business practices, must have felt like a final, devastating blow. I knew then, with chilling clarity, that the family's attempt to clean up their marriage with me, to push me out, had been a calculated smokescreen. It wasn't just about preserving Sarah's purity from my perceived unworthiness. It was to distract from their own rotten core, and perhaps more importantly, to prevent me from digging deeper, from uncovering the very secrets I had just exposed. The confrontation had exploded. Chad and Becky, initially drawn in by the shouting, had witnessed their parents' marriage collapse under the immense weight of decades of secrets. The perfect Anderson facade, the one built on old money and careful appearances, was irrevocably cracked. Sarah spoke of a profound sense of betrayal. It wasn't just the corruption, the dirty money, or the environmental damage. It was the hypocrisy that had poisoned her understanding of love and marriage, of family values she had held dear. She had lived in a gilded cage of lies. As she spoke, I could hear the shift in her perspective. My actions, which she had initially seen as a desperate, perhaps even cruel act of revenge, now appeared to her as something else. A desperate attempt to force truth into a family built entirely on a foundation of lies. She was caught, I knew, between the man she loved and the family she thought she knew. The future of both hanging precariously in the balance. It was a costly choice, one that would redefine everything. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The Anderson estate, once a bastion of carefully cultivated order and quiet affluence, became a battleground. Sarah relayed the details to me in hushed, broken sentences over the next few days. Robert and Patricia, their carefully constructed lives unraveling, engaged in vicious arguments that echoed through the grand halls. Decades of resentment, of unfaithfulness, of unspoken compromises and bitter truths spilled out into the open. The air in the house was thick with accusations and recriminations. The polite veneer stripped away, revealing raw, ugly emotions. Chad, predictably, reacted with a furious defensiveness. He saw the entire family's collapse as a direct threat to his own carefully planned future in Anderson Properties. He tried to protect his parents' image, to spin the narrative, to contain the damage. He feared the fallout on his budding career more than he feared the moral implications of his family's actions. Every phone call I overheard him make was laced with frantic energy, trying to plug the leaks in their sinking ship. Becky, the quieter sister, retreated further into herself. Sarah mentioned that Becky mostly stayed in her room, glued to her phone, a growing sense of detachment shielding her from the ugliness consuming her parents. The weight of the family's secrets seemed to crush her, leaving her hollowed out. Sarah herself was heartbroken and disillusioned. She questioned everything about her upbringing, every carefully imparted lesson on integrity and community service now ringing hollow. The values her parents had preached were nothing but a smokescreen for their own avarice and deceit. She stayed with me in our loft, but the revelations had created a chasm between us too. Her eyes held a haunted look, and her touch was tentative. This was the collateral damage of my actions, the unforeseen cost of seeking justice. I struggled with her withdrawal. I had wanted justice, yes, and I knew the truth was necessary, but not at the cost of her pain. I saw the shadow of grief in her eyes, the slow erosion of her certainty, and it tore at me. "I never wanted to hurt you, Sarah," I said one evening, my voice raw, the words feeling inadequate and small against the enormity of her suffering. I couldn't let them do this to us. To you." Jim, ever the steady anchor, offered quiet support during this time. "You did what you had to do, Frank," he told me over the phone, his voice calm and reassuring. "The truth, however painful, was necessary. It's better that she knows. Better it comes from you than from someone else twisting it." His words were a balm, but they didn't erase the look in Sarah's eyes. Meanwhile, the ripples of my revelations spread outwards. The city councilman, the one implicated in Patricia's affair, and Robert's land deals, hearing whispers that inevitably began to circulate in the tight-knit political circles, started his own damage control. Sources I'd cultivated mentioned frantic meetings, hurried phone calls, a flurry of activity aimed at preserving his own position, adding another layer of political intrigue to the deeply personal drama. Then the reporters started sniffing around, anonymously tipped off, perhaps by a disgruntled Anderson employee I had discreetly sought out during my investigations. They began asking pointed questions about Anderson properties. Their initial inquiries were about the environmental impact studies for the proposed industrial park, but soon their questions grew broader, more probing. Robert, facing both the terrifying prospect of legal exposure and the agonizing reality of his marriage's collapse, began to crumble under the pressure. The stoic businessman facade cracked, revealing a man on the verge of breaking. He canceled meetings, his calls went unanswered, his movements became erratic. He was losing control. Patricia, however, was different. Even in her shame, she remained defiant. Sarah reported her mother was making desperate, angry phone calls, vowing to protect her reputation at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing others. Her own children, perhaps. Her husband, certainly. Her resolve, fueled by fear and pride, was chilling. The Anderson family, once a monolithic pillar of the community, was visibly fracturing. Their perfect facade, meticulously maintained for decades, was not just cracked, it was shattering for all to see. As the legal net tightened, Robert Anderson grew desperate. He attempted the predictable, reaching out to potential witnesses with offers of money, trying to silence them. He ordered the destruction of incriminating documents, pushing his staff to shred records and delete files. But I had anticipated this. Jim and I, along with the astute lawyer he'd recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Brenda, had spent weeks securing multiple copies of everything. Digital, physical, notarized affidavits from a few brave, disillusioned employees. Robert was playing a game of chess, but I had already moved my king. Patricia, ever the social strategist, took a different approach. She began leveraging her remaining social connections, the whispers in the country club, the polite conversations at charity galas. She subtly leaked rumors about my opportunism, my greed, painting me as a ruthless outsider trying to tear down a respectable family. The stories were insidious, carefully crafted to undermine my character without being outright libelous. Brenda, my lawyer, was formidable. She prepared us for a full legal battle, meticulous in her approach. I knew there was no backing down now. The stakes were too high, not just for me, but for Sarah. Sarah, she had retreated into a quiet shell after the initial explosion. But slowly I watched a new resolve take root in her. One evening, after a long silence, she looked at me, her eyes clear despite their lingering sadness. "I'll help you, Frank," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I can't let them keep doing this. It's wrong." It was a difficult choice for her, a decision that deeply wounded her. I saw the pain in her eyes, the feeling of betraying her own blood. But she believed it was the only path to genuine integrity, for herself and for what remained of her family's legacy. She began cooperating with Brenda, providing inside information about her family's convoluted operations, the unspoken rules, the hidden accounts. Chad, of course, discovered her involvement. He cornered her one afternoon at the old family office, his face red with fury. "You're ruining everything, Sarah," he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "Siding with him? You're disloyal. You're destroying Mom and Dad, destroying this family." Sarah met his fury with a quiet, devastating calm. "You already did that, Chad," she told him. "All of you did." Then a surprising turn. Becky, my quiet, detached sister-in-law. One afternoon, Sarah received a text from her, a series of cryptic dates in a single name. When Sarah showed it to me, my blood ran cold. It was the name of a private investigator Robert had hired years ago to quietly discredit a rival developer. The dates coincided with some of the more elaborate shell company setups I'd uncovered. Becky's action, small and subtle, revealed a hidden moral compass, a silent act of conscience that surprised us all. It was a crucial piece of information that helped Brenda connect more dots. The city councilman, sensing the inevitable collapse, finally issued a public statement. He denied any wrongdoing, citing unfortunate misunderstandings and baseless accusations. But the cracks in his story were evident to anyone paying attention. His carefully chosen words sounded hollow, his composure forced. Frank and Sarah became the subject of intense public scrutiny. Rumors about their marriage, my supposed opportunistic motivations. and the Anderson family's imminent downfall spread like wildfire through our Midwestern town. Our names were whispered in grocery store aisles, debated over coffee at the diner. We were no longer just Frank and Sarah. We were players in a public scandal. Through it all, we found solace in each other. Our shared struggle for truth, for whatever justice we could salvage, slowly began to rebuild our fractured trust. Holding her hand, watching her sleep, feeling her silent presence beside me, these moments became anchors in a storm of chaos. But the emotional toll was immense. Sarah grew thinner, her eyes perpetually tired. I found myself making difficult choices, weighing how much damage to inflict, balancing the need for justice with the potential irreparable harm to Sarah, and even to Becky. It was a tightrope walk, and the fall felt imminent. The legal proceedings began with the cold, sterile formality of a court hearing. Brenda laid out the case with precision, each piece of evidence a hammer blow against the Anderson empire. The full extent of Anderson Properties' malfeasance, from the environmental violations on the industrial park land to the intricate web of fraud and kickbacks, was unraveled for all to see. The town, accustomed to the Andersons' untouchable status, watched in stunned disbelief. Robert's public image, once polished and impenetrable, was shattered. The local papers, initially hesitant, now ran front-page stories detailing the allegations. He faced potential charges for fraud, for environmental destruction, for a litany of crimes he'd committed under the guise of civic duty. The man who had once commanded respect now walked with his head down, the weight of public condemnation a visible burden on his hunched shoulders. Patricia's affair, once a whispered secret, became a scandalous headline. The city councilman, caught in the crossfire, saw his own career implode, dragged down by the sordid details. Patricia's carefully constructed facade of respectability, painstakingly built over decades of social climbing and charitable appearances, crumbled into dust. She was no longer the elegant matriarch. She was simply the humiliated wife, her name synonymous with scandal. Chad, caught in the vortex of his parents' downfall, found his own career prospects dissolving. His connections, once solid, now viewed him with suspicion. His name, once a badge of honor, was tainted, stained by the family's notoriety. The future he had so meticulously planned, the one he had tried to protect by fighting me, evaporated before his eyes. Becky, however, found her voice. Witnessing the complete implosion of her family, the ugliness of their secrets, she made a definitive stand. She quietly testified, her voice steady and clear, against her father's illegal practices. Her moral compass, once hidden, now guided her, even as it tore her further from her parents. She provided additional context, details only an insider would know, reinforcing Brenda's case. Sarah experienced a deep sense of grief for the family she'd lost. The ideal, the myth, had died, replaced by a harsh, ugly truth. Yet even through her sorrow, she felt a grim satisfaction in the truth finally coming out. The weight of their secrets had been suffocating, and now, for better or worse, the air felt clearer. I too felt the impact of my actions. Threats came, not directly, but through veiled warnings from some of the Andersons' powerful associates. A car followed me home one night. An anonymous call advised me to watch my step. It was a constant reminder of the dangerous game I was playing, the kind of people I had provoked. I continued to feel the weight of what I'd done, the destruction I'd wrought. The lives upended, even if it was for a just cause. The moral ambiguity of it all was a constant companion. The strain on Frank and Sarah's relationship was immense. We clung to each other in the quiet moments, our hands clasped, our eyes seeking reassurance. We were still together, but the scars were profound, etched deep into the fabric of our trust. The easy intimacy we once shared was replaced by a shared battle, a grim solidarity. Then the news came. Robert Anderson, cornered and broken, suffered a heart attack. It wasn't entirely unexpected, given the stress, but it added a tragic, somber note to the escalating conflict. He was rushed to the hospital, his condition critical. The man who had been so imposing, so powerful, was now a fragile figure on the brink. Patricia, stripped of her status, her husband incapacitated, retaliated in a final petty act of cruelty. She moved to seize Sarah's inheritance, claiming it as compensation for family damages, in legal fees. It was a vicious, vindictive move designed solely to inflict pain. The town, initially shocked, now began to process the deeper reality of their powerful family's hidden darkness. Conversations shifted from gossip to reflection, prompting people to question their own unspoken complicity, their silent acceptance of the Andersons' influence. The facade had cracked for everyone, revealing the rot beneath. Robert Anderson survived his heart attack, a hollowed-out version of the man he once was. He faced legal and personal ruin, his empire in shambles, his power stripped away. Patricia's frantic attempts to salvage her finances and tattered reputation proved futile. She became isolated, disgraced, a ghost haunting her own past. Chad, his ambitions crushed, left town, the once proud Anderson name now a heavy burden he couldn't escape. Becky, with Sarah's quiet support, found the courage to carve out her own path, distanced from her family's toxic legacy. Frank and Sarah attended the court hearings, day after day, listening as the painful truths were laid bare for the public. The legal consequences for Anderson properties were severe, culminating in hefty fines and the forced divestment of land. The city councilman, entangled in the scandal, resigned in disgrace, his career in shambles. Frank reflected on the cost of his victory. He had saved his marriage from a manipulative divorce, but he had also irrevocably shattered a family and deeply wounded the woman he loved. Sarah found a fierce strength in her own integrity, but she carried the deep sadness of a lost past, a tarnished lineage she could never fully escape. They made a choice to stay together, their love forged in fire, stripped of any illusions, built on a brutal honesty. Their future remained uncertain, but it was theirs. The Anderson estate, once a symbol of impenetrable wealth, now stood as a cold, imposing monument to its owner's downfall, its windows reflecting a gray, indifferent sky. Frank and Sarah moved forward, quietly rebuilding their lives, facing the hard-won freedom and the quiet desolation left in the wake of such profound truths in their small Midwestern town. Robert Anderson survived his heart attack, a hollowed-out version of the man he once was. He faced legal and personal ruin, his empire in shambles, his power stripped away. Patricia's frantic attempts to salvage her finances and tattered reputation proved futile. She became isolated, disgraced, a ghost haunting her own past. Chad, his ambitions crushed, left town, the once proud Anderson name now a heavy burden he couldn't escape. Becky, with Sarah's quiet support, found the courage to carve out her own path, distanced from her family's toxic legacy. Frank and Sarah attended the court hearings, day after day, listening as the painful truths were laid bare for the public. The legal consequences for Anderson properties were severe, culminating in hefty fines and the forced divestment of land. The city councilman, entangled in the scandal, resigned in disgrace, his career in shambles. Frank reflected on the cost of his victory. He had saved his marriage from a manipulative divorce, but he had also irrevocably shattered a family and deeply wounded the woman he loved. Sarah found a fierce strength in her own integrity, but she carried the deep sadness of a lost past, a tarnished lineage she could never fully escape. They made a choice to stay together, their love forged in fire, stripped of any illusions, built on a brutal honesty. Their future remained uncertain, but it was theirs. The Anderson estate, once a symbol of impenetrable wealth, now stood as a cold, imposing monument to its owner's downfall, its windows reflecting a gray, indifferent sky. Frank and Sarah moved forward, quietly rebuilding their lives, facing the hard-won freedom and the quiet desolation left in the wake of such profound truths in their small Midwestern town.